Imagine this. You're walking through the cool marble halls of a Roman villa at sunset. The flicker of oil lamps throws soft shadows on walls painted with vivid scenes. Behind thin curtains, you can hear soft voices. Domina, the lady of the house, is talking with her slave girls, going over the beauty routines planned for the next day. The air is filled with the sweet smell of rose oil, burning incense, and something sharper, something metallic that hints at danger. A senator's wife steps out from her private room. Her face is coated with a layer of white lead, and her lips are painted a deep red using cosmetics laced with mercury products that, over time, will slowly poison her. She walks with elegance toward her husband's study, where important guests are waiting, but every step she takes is shaped by customs so unfamiliar to us today. They feel more like scenes from a dream than real life. Before we dive deeper into these powerful and often painful stories from the past, if you're someone who loves uncovering the hidden truths of history, go ahead and tap the like button and subscribe for more videos like this. And leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. It amazes me that we can come together from all over the world to explore these ancient worlds, connected by our shared curiosity about how people lived so long ago, what we think of today as intimacy. The private moments between lovers, the way we care for our appearance, the bonds between family members existed in ancient Rome, too, but the ways they expressed these things were so different from ours. They force us to rethink what we think we know about human behavior. These weren't rare or unusual aspects of Roman life. They were normal, built into the laws, religion, and daily customs that shaped their society. The power structures, gender expectations, and views on sex in Rome followed rules that might shock and intrigue us at the same time. In 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius erupted and covered Pompeii in volcanic ash, it froze a moment in time. It preserved not just buildings and bodies, but clues about how Romans lived behind closed doors. Archaeologists have uncovered bedrooms decorated with erotic artwork, bathhouses with carefully organized social rules, and private spaces where pleasure, pain, and power mixed in ways that challenge how we define them today. Take the Roman idea of pudictia. It's often translated as chastity or modesty, but the truth goes much deeper. For Roman women, pudictia wasn't just about staying sexually pure. It was about striking a very precise balance between being available and being restrained, based entirely on what their role in society expected of them. A senator's wife, for example, had to be sexually open to her husband, but absolutely off-limits to any other man. Not because she chose this, but because her behavior reflected her husband's status and reputation. Her body and actions were part of his political identity. Livia Drusilla, the wife of Emperor Augustus, understood this perfectly, managed this delicate balance so well that she became the gold standard for how a Roman woman was supposed to behave. She wasn't just a model wife, she was a symbol of Roman female virtue itself. Behind closed doors, she was said to have quietly built a web of informants, mostly slave girls from wealthy households, who fed her personal details about the private lives of her husband's political enemies. She knew that in Rome, personal matters were often political weapons. Secrets from the bedroom could destroy careers or shift power. Marriage in ancient Rome, especially among the upper class, was more like a business deal than a romantic commitment. Families didn't focus on love, they arranged marriages to grow their fortunes, secure political ties, and ensure their bloodline continued with legitimate children. If love happened later, it was seen as a lucky extra, not the goal. For many couples, the wedding night was the first time they were ever alone together, and the pressure to seal the deal wasn't just emotionally, it was social and political. Pliny the Younger, in a letter dated 97 AD, described one such night involving a young girl from a well-known family. She was just 14, shaking with nerves as her mother and aunts dressed her and coached her for the moment that would officially turn her from a child into a wife. Meanwhile, her new husband, who was 20 years older, waited in the next room. Elder women gave the girl instructions for responsibilities she was far too young to truly understand. The marriage bed had been carefully prepared. It was blessed by the household gods, sprinkled with holy water, and covered in cloth dyed a very specific shade of red, meant to hide any blood that marked the end of the bride's virginity. Roman views on sex didn't follow a simple male-female divide. Instead, they operated within a strict social hierarchy. Whether someone was a citizen, non-citizen, slave, freed person, or foreigner shaped not only their place in society, but also what was expected or allowed of them sexually. A Roman male citizen, for example, could have sexual relations with slaves, prostitutes, or foreigners without harming his reputation. But if he pursued the wife or daughter of another Roman citizen, that could lead to scandal or even death. Gaius Silius found this out the hard way in 48 AD. He secretly married Valeria Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, while the emperor was away from Rome. Whether or not the marriage was legally binding wasn't the point. What mattered was that it challenged imperial power. When Claudius returned, both Silius and Messalina were executed. Their crime wasn't just adultery. It was undermining the political structure through a sexual act. Slavery added even more layers to this already complex system. Household slaves were treated as property and, more disturbingly, as extensions of their master's body. They could be used sexually at will, with no rights, no protections, and no ability to say no. Wealthy Romans often kept specific types of slaves for personal needs. Some handled beauty treatments, some worked in bedrooms known as cubic, and others served as long-term sexual partners, or concubines, alongside a legal spouse. Marcus Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome during the 1st century BC, was said to own over 500 slaves in just his city residence. Many of them were chosen purely for their physical attractiveness and were trained in skills far beyond basic housework. Writers from that era hint at complex rituals and customs that took place within homes like his, especially in the private spaces few ever saw. Evening gatherings in elite Roman homes often went far beyond simple entertainment. Slaves didn't just perform music or recite poetry, they were also expected to provide intimate services. These events blurred the line between performance, worship, and outright sexual exploitation. Roman bathhouses created their own unique world. They were places to relax and socialize, but they also allowed for carefully managed interactions that included everything from casual flirtation to secret sexual arrangements. While men and women usually bathed in separate areas, the nearby common spaces gave them opportunities to mingle, and sometimes those encounters led to private deals. Seneca the Younger, writing around 60 AD, once complained about living above a busy bathhouse. He described the constant noise, men grunting as they lifted weights, the sound of slaps during massages, people screaming as their body hair was plucked with hot tweezers, and, underneath all that, quiet conversations between authors and attendants offering services that definitely weren't listed on any public sign. His irritation gives us a glimpse into how openly sex work operated. Even in places meant for public hygiene and wellness, when it came to body grooming, especially hair removal, upper-class Romans took things to extreme levels. Both men and women followed painful routines to remove body hair, often with the help of slaves trained for this specific purpose. These slaves, called alipolari, used methods that were harsh and often excruciating: heated tweezers, sticky homemade wax made from pine resin, and even rough pumice stones that literally scraped hair off the skin. Martial, a Spanish-born poet from the 1st century AD, wrote about seeing a senator's wife undergo one of these depilation sessions. The way he described it made it clear it wasn't just painful, it was almost ritualistic. But in elite Roman society, the appearance of smooth, hairless skin was a status symbol worth suffering for. She lay completely still as her slave. Girl carefully used heated bronze tweezers to pull out every hair from her arms and legs to the most private areas. She showed no emotion, just the calm, dignified look expected from a Roman matron. Silent tears rolled down her face, but she never made a sound. Expressing pain would have been seen as weakness. The procedure took hours. By the end, her skin was raw, irritated, and even bleeding, but it was hairless, as fashion and status demanded. In her world, looking flawless came at a high physical cost. Ancient Roman cosmetics were just as dangerous. Many beauty products used by upper-class women contained toxic substances that we now know to be deadly. White face powder made from lead carbonate gave them the pale look associated with wealth and refinement, but over time, it caused lead poisoning, damaging the brain, causing infertility, and even leading to death. Red cheeks and lips were often achieved using rouge made from mercury compounds, which slowly destroyed the nervous system. Kohl eyeliner was typically made with antimony and other poisonous metals. The Roman poet Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, written around 02 AD, gave detailed beauty recipes for women, recipes that, in hindsight, read like instructions for slow poisoning. For example, mix white lead with vinegar until it becomes a paste, then apply thickly to the face and neck. For lip color, blend cinnabar with rose oil and animal fat. For eyeliner, combine antimony with honey and wine. Women who followed these routines literally painted themselves to death, sacrificing their health and lifespan for an appearance that society demanded. When it came to birth control and abortion, Roman methods were often just as risky. They relied on herbs and procedures that were sometimes more dangerous than the pregnancies they were meant to avoid. One of the most prized contraceptives was silphium, a plant that grew along the Libyan coast. It was so effective and so valuable that it was pictured on Syrian coins and sold for its weight in silver. But its chemical compounds were so strong that taking too much could be deadly. Eventually, the plant was harvested to extinction. Cyrannus of Ephesus, a Greek doctor working in Rome during the 2nd century AD, recorded other birth control techniques in his writings on gynecology. But many of these methods were crude, painful, and potentially fatal, offering women few safe choices when it came to controlling their reproductive lives. Some women tried to prevent pregnancy by inserting wool soaked in honey, cedar resin, or vinegar before sex. Others drank mixtures made from copper, sulfate, iron rust, or even crushed insects. Some believed they could avoid conception by exercising violently, soaking in hot baths, or purposely falling down. These methods were often painful and dangerous, but Cyrannus of Ephesus described them in a matter-of-fact tone, his clinical words hiding the truth. These women were risking their lives because they had so few other options. In a society where their choices were limited by law and custom, controlling their fertility came at great personal risk. Abortion was even more dangerous. While Roman law usually allowed it treating the fetus as part of the mother's body, the methods available were harsh and often deadly. Some women took toxic herbs like pennyroyal, rue, or savin to induce miscarriage. These plants worked by poisoning the body, putting the entire system in crisis. Others chose mechanical procedures using bronze tools that were crude and risky. These often caused internal injuries, bleeding, or infections that could be fatal. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History around 77 AD, told of one wealthy woman who tried to end an unwanted pregnancy. She had taken different herbs for several days, growing weaker and more desperate. At last, she let a Greek doctor insert bronze instruments into her womb. Her female relatives held her down while she bit into a leather strap to keep from screaming. The procedure ended the pregnancy. Within days, she developed a severe infection. She died in agony. Her family told neighbors she had died of a fever, too ashamed to reveal what had really happened. Roman views on homosexuality were shaped not by ideas of love or mutual affection, but by power, dominance, and social rank. Sexual relationships between men were common and even praised so long as the roles followed strict rules. A Roman citizen could take the active role with a slave, a foreigner, or someone of lower status without fear of judgment. But if a man allowed himself to be penetrated, no matter the reason, it was seen as deeply dishonorable. Even if it was consensual, the act was considered shameful and, in some cases, criminal. Julius Caesar was haunted by rumors throughout his career that he had once been the passive partner of King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia when he was a young man. His political enemies mocked him, calling him the Queen of Bithynia, and claimed that his military victories were overcompensation for this alleged humiliation. Whether the story was true didn't really matter. What mattered was the damage it did to his image. In Roman culture, a man who had been sexually dominated could never be trusted to hold political power. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with the beautiful young Antinous shocked some Romans, not because it was between two men, but because Hadrian's deep emotional attachment seemed to violate the Roman ideal of masculine control. A ruler was expected to dominate, not to grieve openly or act out of love. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 AD, Hadrian was devastated. In his grief, he deified the young man, making him a god, and even founded a city in his name. Many Romans saw these gestures not as noble, but as embarrassing signs of emotional weakness and romantic obsession, unfit for a man in power. Roman prostitution, unlike many other parts of intimate life, was legally regulated. Sex workers were divided into different legal and social categories. Meretrices were licensed prostitutes who worked in brothels and paid taxes on their earnings. Ancilla were slave women, whose owners rented them out for sex. Pharmaceae were women from higher classes who had fallen from grace upon through adultery or scandal, and turned to informal prostitution to survive. The ruins of a brothel in Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash, give us a glimpse into the working lives of Roman sex workers. The rooms were little more than stone cells, just big enough for a narrow bed. The walls were painted with explicit frescoes showing different sexual positions and prices. Client graffiti still survives today. Some scrawled their names or crude reviews, while others left surprising traces of affection. One message reads, "Restituta, you move your hips so sweetly," a reminder that even in commercial sex, human connection could sometimes slip through. In Rome, the Subura district was the heart of the city's nightlife, packed with brothels, taverns, and entertainers. Wealthy men often visited in disguise. They wore plain clothes, hid their rings, and covered their faces to avoid being recognized. Juvenal, writing around 100 AD, described senators and even priests sneaking into these places after dark, dressed like commoners. By morning, they returned to their villas and their proper public roles, pretending the night had never happened, as if it belonged to a different world with different rules. Marriage among Rome's elite wasn't driven by love, it was often a strategic alliance. Marriage contracts, many of which survive on papyrus and bronze, looked more like business deals than romantic promises. These documents spelled out who owned what, how often sex was expected, which birth control methods were allowed, and what punishments would apply for cheating. One contract from 134 AD between two powerful Roman families included a specific clause: the wife shall submit to her husband's sexual requests no fewer than twice per week, unless prevented by illness, menstruation, or religious purification. She shall not refuse unusual acts unless they cause physical harm or involve additional persons. Such cold, contractual language highlights the reality behind Roman marriage. It was less about love and more about duty, ownership, and control. If the wife failed to meet these conditions, financial penalties were deducted from her dowry, a painful reminder that Roman marriages were bound more by contracts than affection. The wedding night itself was steeped in ritual, all aimed at promoting fertility and harmony in the marriage. As tradition required, the bride was carried over the threshold, not just for show, but to prevent evil spirits from entering her body through the soles of her feet. Her hair was arranged using a spear that had once killed a gladiator, symbolizing the bravery she would need for childbirth. The marriage bed was then blessed by matrons, women who had married only once and had living children. Meanwhile, young boys scattered nuts and fruits across the floor, hoping to bring fertility to the union. The Roman poet Catullus, in his wedding song for Unia and Manlius around 60 BC, described the emotional intensity of the ceremony before the couple's first night together. The bride sat in silence while older women undressed her from her childhood garments and dressed her in the saffron-colored gown of marriage. Her face was painted with sacred clay, and her hair was tied with ribbons blessed by the household gods. She cried not from sadness, but from sheer fear of the unknown, of the enormous change that was about to come. In the next room, the groom drank wine with his male relatives. They offered him advice, some of it crude, some sincere, about what was expected of him before morning. Among Rome's upper classes, divorce was surprisingly easy to initiate. Her spouse could simply declare the marriage over. But the consequences were not equal. A man could end a marriage and remarry almost immediately, with no damage to his status or fortune. Women, however, risked far more. A divorced woman might lose custody of her children, face financial hardship, and suffer severe judgment from society. Roman law tended to side with men in disputes over property and inheritance. In an effort to control what he saw as declining family values, Emperor Augustus passed the Lex Julia de Adulterius et Deord Nobis in 18 BC. This law required men to marry and imposed penalties on lifelong bachelors or those who divorced without good reason. But the plan backfired badly. Instead of encouraging stable marriages, it led to fraud. A black market of fake marriages quickly took shape. Some men married slave women only to free them right after the ceremony, bypassing the law's intent. Others arranged sham marriages with foreign women who lived far away and were never expected to appear in Rome. Roman religious festivals often pushed the limits of what modern people might consider appropriate. Many of them openly celebrated sexuality in ways that would shock today's audiences, mixing religious devotion with explicit acts that reflected Rome's very different relationship with the body, power, and pleasure. The Floralia, held every April in honor of the goddess Flora, was one of ancient Rome's most sexually explicit public festivals. It featured nude dancing, provocative theater, and even public sex acts believed to help promote fertility in both crops and people. Respectable married women usually stayed away, but prostitutes, slaves, and freedwomen took part with great enthusiasm. Martial, writing about the Floralia in 88 AD, described a packed theater filled with citizens who, in their private lives, would have condemned this kind of behavior. Yet in the moment, they cheered wildly as naked performers acted out scenes that would shock even the most notorious brothel. Senators sat side by side with slaves, all pretending their presence was due to religious devotion, not curiosity. On stage, actors coupled to the sound of sacred music, and the crowd applauded without shame. The goddess Flora was said to reward those who worshipped her. By casting off modesty completely, the audience was eager to please her. Roman medical writings show a similar blending of science with social ideas about gender, power, and morality. Doctors like Galen provided detailed studies of the human body and how sex worked, but their medical advice often reinforced Roman social rules more than scientific fact. For example, many Roman physicians believed that a woman had to feel sexual pleasure in order to conceive. At the same time, they warned that too much pleasure made women morally unstable or hard to control. Cyrannus of Ephesus, a well-known physician of the 2nd century AD, gave advice to midwives that reflected this thinking. He instructed them that if labor was slow, they should ask whether the woman had felt satisfaction at the time of conception. According to Cyrannus, pleasure helped open the womb and ease the baby's descent. If she hadn't experienced it, the birth might need help through herbs or physical intervention. He also claimed that women who conceived through rape or out of duty often had harder labors, while those who conceived through passion gave birth more easily. Roman sexual education began early and continued throughout adolescence, but it looked very different depending on your gender. Boys were taught by older male relatives, tutors, and even through first-hand experience with slaves. Their lessons emphasized dominance, experience, and pleasure. Girls, on the other hand, were taught mainly by their mothers and other married women. Their education focused on obedience, endurance, and modesty, not personal desire or agency. Coming-of-age rituals reflected these differences. Roman boys officially became men at a ceremony called the toga virilis, usually held at age 16. It included offerings to the household gods, formal declarations of manhood, and private conversations about sexual responsibilities. Archaeological evidence suggests that these private talks weren't just about theory. In many cases, they included organized visits to brothels or arranged encounters with experienced slaves. These early experiences were intended to teach Roman boys how to act as dominant men in both public and private life. Roman poetry gives us rare glimpses into the emotional lives of people trying to navigate a world shaped by strict expectations about sex, power, and status. The poet Catullus, for example, wrote passionately about his affair with a woman he called Lesbia. Certainly Clodia Metelli, the sister of a powerful politician. His poems move between moments of blissful love and intense jealousy. Despite living in a society where love was considered less important than duty or marriage, Catullus's verses reveal deep emotional intensity, proof that Romans, too, felt the full spectrum of human attachment and heartbreak. Yet even in these personal poems, Roman views on gender and control are hard to miss. Catullus praises Lesbia for her cleverness and charm, but when their relationship falls apart, his words turn bitter and violent. He lashes out at her male lovers, threatening them with rape and humiliation. In Roman culture, emotional pain was often met with the language of sexual dominance. Love and power were so closely tied that tenderness could turn brutal the moment social boundaries were crossed. Even Roman funeral practices reflected beliefs about sexuality and emotional bonds. Wealthy families often commissioned grand tombs, showing married couples reclining side by side, with the wife gently resting her hand on her husband's cesta, symbol of eternal love and loyalty. These monuments were meant to show that not even death could break the union between two people bound by love and desire. Some tombs included erotic art and personal items meant for intimate use, suggesting that Romans believed sexual pleasure might continue in the afterlife or, at the very least, that a person's sensual identity remained part of how they were remembered. Whether these items were meant to ensure pleasure beyond death or simply reflected the passions of the deceased remains a topic of debate. Among scholars, Roman views on aging and sexuality were very different from modern ones. Older men were expected to remain sexually active, and many wealthy Roman men married much younger women to satisfy that expectation. But older women faced different pressures. Widows were encouraged to remarry for financial or social reasons, but if a post-woman showed sexual interest, she was often ridiculed. The satirist Juvenal mocked older women who chased after younger men. One of his characters, Ippia, grandmother of 7, leaves her husband and runs off with a gladiator to Egypt. Her face is wrinkled, but she paints it like a young bride. She wears luxurious silk, but no one is fooled by the disguise. The gladiator takes her money and jewels, but when she reaches out to him in bed, he turns away in disgust, muttering, "Some coins are just too expensive to earn." Roman slavery often gave rise to deeply personal relationships that existed in a gray area, emotionally meaningful but legally invisible. Slaves weren't allowed to marry under Roman law, but that didn't stop them from forming strong emotional bonds. Within households, these unions were sometimes acknowledged informally, even if they held no legal standing. Occasionally, a master would free a beloved slave to marry them, but even then, the relationship remained shaped by the unequal power that had defined its beginning. Children born to enslaved women automatically became the legal property of the mother's owner, regardless of who the father was. This meant families could be torn apart at any time, without warning or recourse. Pliny the Younger once wrote to a friend about his grief after losing his slave, Zosimus. "He was more than a servant to me. He was a companion who shared my meals, my bed, and my secrets. When he became ill, I cared for him myself rather than assign the task to other slaves. Since his death, there's been a void in my home that no one can fill. I've freed his son and commissioned a tombstone that names Zosimus not as my property, but as my dear friend. I know some will see this as too much emotion for a mere slave, but I don't care." This letter captures the emotional complexity of Roman slavery. Real affection could exist, but always under the shadow of control. Marriage in Rome also came, in many forms, each with its own level of legal and social weight. Confarreatio was the most formal marriage ceremony, reserved for the aristocracy. It involved sacred religious rites and made divorce extremely difficult. Coemptio was a symbolic purchase of the bride, transferring her from her father's legal control to her husband's. Then there was Secunda, kind of common law marriage formed when a woman lived with a man for one uninterrupted year, unless she left for at least 3 nights in a row. These different marriage types reflected Rome's complex social ladder. Wealthy families preferred confarreatio to ensure full legitimacy and inheritance rights. Poorer Romans often relied on usus, which required no ceremony or paperwork but offered fewer legal protections, especially for women. Roman attitudes towards sex included many practices that would seem deeply troubling today. One example is pederasty, sexual relationships between adult men and adolescent boys. While this was accepted, and sometimes even admired, it had to follow strict social guidelines. The older male was expected to take the dominant role, not just sexually but socially and intellectually. The younger boy, ideally from a freeborn family, was supposed to learn from the relationship about politics, rhetoric, and Roman ideals of manhood. But when these rules were ignored, or the relationship was seen as exploitative, it could lead to public scandal or legal punishment. In ancient Rome, adult men involved in relationships with adolescent boys were expected to play 2 roles: the active sexual partner and the young boy's cultural mentor. These relationships were viewed not as exploitative, but as educational, a way to pass on Roman values, intellect, and refinement. However, from a modern perspective, we now recognize the serious emotional and psychological risks involved. The power dynamics in these relationships were deeply imbalanced, and what Romans called mentorship often crossed lines that would now be recognized as harmful. Roman literature offers vivid sometimes disturbing, insights into these dynamics. In his Satyricon written around 60 AD, Petronius explores the obsessive love of the narrator for a boy named Giton. His beauty tormented me more than it satisfied me. I wanted to possess him, not just his body, but his thoughts and dreams. But when others looked at him with desire, I didn't feel proud, I felt terrified, afraid they'd steal what I thought belonged to me. Love and ownership blurred together, and I no longer knew if I was his guardian or his jailer. This raw confession reflects how easily affection in Roman society could become entangled with control, jealousy, and dominance, especially when the beloved was socially or physically vulnerable. Roman religion also included sexual rituals that were thought to bring divine blessings or protection. In some temples, sacred prostitutes acted as spiritual intermediaries between worshippers and the gods. The cult of Cybele, a goddess especially revered by soldiers and traders, performed rituals so intense they shocked even other Romans. Male priests of Cybele, known as the Galli, castrated themselves in a state of religious ecstasy, then lived as women in devotion to the goddess. These priests didn't fit into Rome's usual social categories. They weren't male or female, slave or citizen. They were seen as sacred, set apart from ordinary human roles, yet also viewed with suspicion by some. Sexual desire also played a major role in Roman magical practices. Archaeologists have uncovered many curse tablets calling on the gods to bind someone with love or lust. One reads, "I bind Gaius Lucius so that he can think of nothing but Claudius, so that he cannot eat, sleep, or find peace until he comes to her bed." Love spells were everywhere, and potions made from herbs, plants, and even animal parts were sold on the street, despite laws banning their use. The line between medicine, magic, and poison was often blurry. Some people used these mixtures hoping to enhance desire or performance, but many ended up sick or worse. When it came to sexual pleasure, Rome held a double standard. Men were encouraged to enjoy sex and indulge themselves as long as they remained in control and upheld their masculine social status. Pleasure was considered their right, even their duty. For women, it was another story. Sexual desire in women was viewed with suspicion. Too much passion was thought to lead to disorder, unfaithfulness, or loss of control. A sexually assertive woman was often ridiculed or treated as a danger to household stability. Roman women were expected to walk a fine line when it came to sexual behavior. They were supposed to enjoy enough pleasure to aid in conception, not so much that they appeared lustful or out of control. This balancing act created deep anxiety for many women, who feared that showing either too much or too little interest could bring shame or even danger. Roman writers often described this emotional tightrope. In Amoras, written around 15 BC, Ovid captured the painful confusion faced by Roman wives. "She lay beneath me like a statue, fulfilling her duty without showing pleasure, afraid that expressing passion might brand her as promiscuous. Yet, when I stopped, she wept, convinced that her coldness had disappointed me." Roman women had to navigate between the Scylla of excessive desire and the Charybdis of seeming to indifferent hand. Many crashed into one shore or the other. Within Roman households, slave sexuality was tightly controlled. Masters had the final say over whether slaves could form relationships, marry, or have children. Enslaved people's bodies were tools used as rewards, punishments, or breeding stock. Some wealthy households kept meticulous records of slave breeding programs, listing physical and mental traits they wanted to pass on. These records, found on papyrus and wax tablets, read more like farm inventories than human genealogies. It's a stark reminder of how fully enslaved people were dehumanized. Roman military life brought its own set of disturbing sexual customs. While soldiers were technically supposed to remain celibate during campaigns, this rule was widely ignored. Rape, forced concubinage, and sexual exploitation of local women were common and often seen as just part of the spoils of war. Julius Caesar hinted at this in his commentaries on the Gallic War, describing what happened after the siege of Alesia. The legions celebrated their victory according to ancient custom. Captured women were distributed among the officers and troops, some to serve as laborers, others for uses that military discipline normally forbade, but victory briefly allowed. He didn't need to be more specific. "The sounds that night," he wrote, "were a mixture of screams and songs of triumph, a chilling harmony that reflected Rome's double identity as both civilizer and destroyer." Roman cities themselves were built with ideas about sex and power quite literally in the walls. Public buildings often had separate entrances and spaces for men and women. Private homes were designed with strict spatial hierarchies: outer rooms for guests, inner rooms for family, and the most secluded chambers reserved for sexual activity. These intimate spaces were often decorated with erotic frescoes and mosaics, celebratory, some violent, revealing what Romans associated with fertility, dominance, and pleasure. Even the famous Roman roads played a role in the empire's sexual economy. These carefully engineered highways allowed not just soldiers and merchants to travel, but also prostitutes, slaves, and entertainers. They followed military units, religious festivals, and trade routes. Along the way, roadside inns often served double duty as brothels. For traveling merchants, sexual services were as expected as food and shelter. Sex in Rome wasn't hidden in the shadows. It moved along its roads, lived in its temples, and echoed in its poetry. The Roman legal system had surprisingly detailed rules about sexual behavior. These laws weren't focused on protecting personal rights or preventing emotional harm. Instead, they aimed to control reproduction, uphold social hierarchies, and maintain public order. Rome's lawmakers were less interested in individual freedom than in preserving the structures that kept society stable and under control. The law spelled out who could have sex with whom, which acts were acceptable, and what punishments applied. If someone crossed the line, it wasn't about consent as we understand it. Today it was about rank, class, gender, and control. Sexual behavior was legally organized in ways that reinforced the power of freeborn men, the subordination of women, and the total lack of autonomy for slaves. Sex also played an economic role in the empire. Rome's taxation system brought in real money from sexual commerce. Prostitutes were required to register with the authorities and pay taxes on their earnings. Brothel owners paid extra taxes on their buildings and services. Even private citizens caught committing adultery could be fined penalties that went straight into the imperial treasury. In other words, sex wasn't just tolerated in ancient Rome, it was regulated, recorded, and taxed. It was a business that contributed directly to the empire's wealth. Roman architecture reflected this openness. Bathhouses, for example, often included small private rooms designed for discreet sexual encounters. Theaters had upper galleries that became known for behind-the-scenes liaisons, officially unacknowledged, but hardly a secret. Even some temples included private areas where worshippers could take part in ritualized sexual acts believed to honor gods or goddesses of fertility and love. Art in ancient Rome also revealed a strikingly different attitude toward sexuality compared to later Western cultures. Frescoes, mosaics, sculpture, and decorated household items often depicted sex with complete frankness. Today, many of these images would be labeled as explicit or even pornographic. But in ancient Roman homes, such artwork was proudly displayed and hidden. It wasn't shameful. It was part of life. These visual records have become vital tools for historians and archaeologists. They show how Romans thought about pleasure, bodies, and relationships, and how closely tied those ideas were to power, beauty, and even religion. Roman thinkers didn't ignore these issues either. Philosophy tackled sex and desire. Hedna, the Stoics, in particular, warned against letting passion take control of the mind. They believed too much sexual indulgence weakened a person's rational judgment and moral discipline. Moderation was the ideal, not abstinence, but balance. Pleasure wasn't evil, but it had to be managed with self-restraint and wisdom. Epicurean philosophers took a different view of pleasure than the Stoics. They believed that pleasure was not only acceptable, it was the natural goal of life, but they also warned that not all pleasures were worth pursuing. Some brought more trouble than joy, and a wise person should learn to tell the difference. The best pleasures were those that brought peace, not pain. This conflict between desire and discipline was something even Rome's leaders struggled with. Marcus Aurelius, Rome's philosopher-emperor, about it often in his journals. "The body seeks pleasure as water seeks its level," he wrote, rushing toward whatever feels good in the moment. But the mind must act like a dam, not to stop the flow completely, but to guide it toward something useful. For him, sexual desire wasn't evil, it was natural, like fire. But fire must be controlled, or it will burn down everything in its path. Roman medical knowledge of sexuality was advanced in some ways and dangerously flawed in others. Doctors had a surprisingly good understanding of reproductive anatomy. They could treat injuries, perform surgeries, and recognize infections. but their work was shaped by social attitudes. Their diagnoses often depended not just on symptoms but on a patient's gender, social rank, or perceived morality. Even farming wasn't free from ideas about sex. Some Roman farmers believed that human fertility could influence the fertility of the land. They timed planting and harvesting to align with their sexual activity. Ancient agricultural manuals even included instructions for when and how couples should have sex, depending on the season, hoping to magically pass their own fertility onto their crops. Sex was also built into Roman entertainment. Gladiator games, stage plays, chariot races, and public festivals all included erotic elements, sometimes in the background, often front and center. Audiences expected excitement, shock, and sexual energy. Many performers also worked as sex workers, and these public events doubled as places where people arranged private encounters. Pleasure and spectacle were part of the same package. Roman poets and writers left behind an emotional record of how people navigated these intense, often contradictory expectations. Writers like Catullus, Ovid, Propertius, and Martial wrote poems and stories full of passion, jealousy, longing, betrayal, and grief. Their words help us understand how Romans lived with and struggled under their own rules about love and sex. These weren't just artistic expressions. They were deeply personal windows into Roman emotional life. Rome also absorbed sexual rituals and beliefs from the cultures it conquered. The empire's religious system was a mix of local Roman traditions and foreign influences, what historians call syncretism. Egyptian, Greek, Syrian, and Germanic practices all shaped Roman ideas about sex, gender, and spiritual power. Mystery cults, like those of Mithras, Isis, and Dionysus, offered emotional and sexual experiences that clashed with traditional Roman values. These secretive religions often emphasized transformation, ecstasy, and liberation from earthly norms, including those about sexual behavior. The Roman economy treated sex work as legitimate business. The state taxed and regulated prostitution, concubinage, and other sexual services because they provided steady revenue. Legal protections existed not out of concern for workers' rights, but to keep the money flowing. Rome had a financial interest in keeping sexual commerce organized and predictable. In short, sexuality in Rome was not hidden, private, or shameful. It was woven into religion, medicine, agriculture, philosophy, literature, architecture, law, and economics. It was everywhere, and everyone had to navigate its rules, whether they benefited from them or were crushed beneath them. Rome's sexual economy had deep roots in its laws, its values, and its day-to-day policies. It wasn't just about morality or religion, it was about control, money, and power. These factors often shaped Roman attitudes more than any sense of virtue. Sex could make or break someone's future. A beautiful slave might gain freedom by becoming a master's lover. A freeborn citizen, on the other hand, could lose everything: status, family, property if caught up in a sexual scandal. Marriages weren't just about love or companionship. They were economic and political alliances. The right marriage could raise an entire family's fortunes. The wrong sexual choice could lead to exile, disgrace, or even execution. Roman technological advances extended into the realm of sexuality as well. Archaeologists have uncovered objects clearly intended for intimate use, crafted from bronze, glass, and other materials. Some were for enhancing pleasure, others for preventing pregnancy, and some were likely used to treat sexual dysfunction, even though many organic materials have rotted away with time. What remains tells us that the Romans were as inventive in the bedroom as they were on the battlefield. Roman medicine included a wide range of potions, ointments, and concoctions, meant to increase libido, boost fertility, or suppress desire. Pharmacology and sexuality went hand in hand. Though the line between cure and poison was often dangerously thin, Rome's colonial system also used sexuality as a tool of domination. Sexual violence wasn't just tolerated during conquests, it was methodical, woven into the structure of imperial power. Conquered people were often forced to follow Roman sexual customs, but without enjoying Roman rights or legal protections. Roman officials frequently took local women as concubines, creating generations of mixed children whose legal status was often ambiguous. These unions blurred the lines between conqueror and conquered, between privilege and dispossession. Even Roman death rituals reflected sexual beliefs. tomb inscriptions praised marriages that were expected to continue in the afterlife. Burial goods sometimes included items linked to sexual life. In some regions, funeral rites even involved sexual elements meant to carry the deceased's vitality into the next world. To the Romans, sexuality didn't end at death, it transformed. Now imagine yourself back in that marble hallway where we began, the polished floors, the oil lamps, the faint scent of incense and those whispers behind thin curtains. But this time, you know what they're saying. You understand that the beauty routines meant to please, to attract were slowly poisoning the women who used them, that the marriage contracts spelled out rights and duties, not unlike livestock arrangements, that the slaves in those grand homes were not just laborers, but people whose bodies could be bought, sold, or violated without consent, that children, especially girls, were married before they even understood what marriage was, that Roman laws and customs carefully calculated who could touch whom, when, how, and under what terms. Yes, Rome gave us roads, laws, architecture, and art that still shape the modern world, but it also gave us systems of human intimacy that were built on inequality, violence, and exploitation, realities we often choose to forget. The Romans weren't monsters. They were people shaped by the norms and power structures of their time, just as we are. The volcanic ash that buried Pompeii didn't just preserve buildings and bodies, it preserved a mirror, a reflection of who we were and who we still are. When we look into that mirror, we may not want to admit what we see, because the truth is, we haven't escaped the power structures that shaped Roman intimacy. We've just hidden them better, wrapped them in politeness, buried them under marketing and laws. But the transactions, the imbalances, and the quiet violence still linger in the most private parts of modern life. The Romans lying in their final poses, frozen mid-step or mid-sleep, don't just show us how they died, they show us how they lived, their relationships, their fears, their needs, and, yes, their desires remain startlingly familiar. Their ghosts whisper across the centuries, not in Latin, but in the shared language of longing, cruelty, survival, and love tangled with power. They remind us, intimacy is never just about pleasure. It's about who holds power, who is denied it, and what a culture truly believes about who counts as fully human. Standing among those ancient ruins, you may find yourself hearing those whispers, too soft, persistent echoes of truths we thought we buried, but that still walk beside us today.